What's up, people of the internet? It is the multiplier here, aka multiplier, aka multiplayer sometimes. But what we're doing is I've got this track called Happy Floaty Cloud Fun. It's off my forthcoming album, Collect All and Rave. Remember the saying? We're not saving, we're raving. That's how it goes. But yes, we're doing another kind of collaboration thing with Splice. So this whole project file and all the presets is kind of available to download. So if you check the link below, it'd be like a link to Splice, and basically allows you to download the whole project, kind of deconstruct it, see how I made all the various bits. You get all the MIDI, you get all the presets, all that kind of stuff. It's all kind of built in, which is really, really cool. It's nice to kind of deconstruct projects. But in this particular video, what we're doing is we're gonna kind of deconstruct how we made one of the bass sounds, or the only real bass sound. So I think it's quite different. It's quite simple as well, which will mean it's kind of easy enough to explain. But it's a little bit different to the way that I normally make basses, and I think it's kind of proof that a lot of the times you can get really interesting, kind of nice and detailed bass sounds without actually programming in millions of kind of arbitrary kind of complexity. But yeah, let's show you a little bit of the song, and then I'll show you a little bit of the bass, and then we'll tell you how we made it using Massive, which is the best synth because it's massive. Get it? Sweet. Let's play a bit of the song just to give you a flavour of the whole track. So we'll just play from like bar 17, and then we'll play like kind of 16 bars or something. Pretty sickness, right? It's called Happy Floaty Cloud Fun because it sounds like you're on a cloud bouncing about. That's the vibe. I'm also going to do a cat cover of this. So I'm going to change out all the instruments and replace them with cat sounds. That's going to happen. True stories, hashtag real talk. So let's get into the actual point of the video, which is let's deconstruct the bass sound and how we made it using Massive. So the bass sound is, well, it sounds like this kind of by itself. So really kind of listen to, there's kind of two parts of the bass sound. There's the attack, just the front of the sound. And then there's kind of the sustain, or the body, or the rest of the sound. And it kind of sounds like, it's almost like layered up, like you'd have just like a main body, and then I've layered a different bass sound for the attack. But it's actually all one sound, which is quite cool. But really listen to those two halves and then kind of think about why they happen in that way. Pretty cool, right? And I think it's really worth kind of noting as well from a more kind of conceptual position. The reason why that works really well is for that attack, you've got quite a lot of mid to high frequencies. So you can really kind of pick out the start of the bass sound in the mix. So your brain can pick out, right, that new note is starting here. So the bass still doesn't your brain can really pick out the bass, which is quite nice. But because the sustain is just all low frequencies and doesn't have those high frequencies in there, it allows room for everything else to sit in the mix as well. So I think it's just a really, really nice way of having that bass kind of sustaining through the whole track, but also just kind of picking out the start of each bass note. Really, really cool. And yeah, let's show you how we made it. So it's basically using Massive. So we'll open up Massive, and it's a preset called Just Funk, which I made. All the presets are available in the project file, and I'll probably include a link to the preset separately anyway, so you don't have to download the project file to get this preset. But it's worth downloading the project file anyway, because there's lots of other presets that I made included, and you get to see kind of how I made the track. It's pretty cool, right? So let's have a look at this. So it's the Just Funk preset. We need to make sure we solo these guys. And then hopefully this works. Cool, it's working. So let's throw a loop on there so we don't get too lost. Right, so Massive. Let's see what's going on. So if you're new to Massive, it's basically called a subtractive wavetable synth. So sound comes out of these oscillators. So you have 3 oscillators on the left-hand side. Naturally, if they're turned on, sound comes out. That's always a good sign. So if we have a look, only oscillator 1 is actually turned on because we're only using 1 oscillator. Nice and simple. And because it's what's called a wavetable synth, each oscillator, what kind of that oscillator kicks out in terms of the actual waveform is determined by the wavetable. And that wavetable is kind of what defines the character of the sound. So whereas with, say, FM synthesis, you start off with some simple waves and then have them interact and they make a complicated wave. With wavetable synthesis, you start off with quite a complicated sound and then you just kind of manipulate it a little bit. So what we did is we chose a wavetable called Digital 2, or no, DigiCook 2. It is quite an interesting sort of sound. What I'll do, I'll turn off the further processing so you can hear what it sounds like, and really simplistically. So if I had to remute that as well. So this is what it sounded like just initially. So when we hadn't done any processing. Just a really simple, really low frequency. What we did is we did some modulations and we also changed the spectrum here to format. So it's quite hard to explain the difference between spectrum and format, but I think it's easier if you want to kind of learn the difference, look it up in the manual, but instead just kind of know it's just a different way of kind of modulating and kind of looking at the frequencies and stuff like that. It's quite silly to explain without diagrams and stuff. But yeah, so we got DigiCook 2 as the wavetable, and then format. So that's almost like our bass. But then we wanted to actually program in some modulation, because remember when you're programming kind of synths or presets, modulation or kind of change is kind of the key. And whether or not you do it subtly or really obviously, it's kind of up to the preset. But we program in this modulation with either envelopes or LFOs normally. So in the case of Massive, the envelopes are blue. So we have one envelope here, so we just click it. And then what we do is we click these little arrows and then we put them kind of on the thing we want to modulate. So we click the arrow, click this, and then, well, in fact, it was muted. And then what you end up doing is just kind of clicking and dragging it around. So you see how wherever that kind of blue ring is, that's determining kind of how this envelope here is modulating that parameter. So you could almost, if we say didn't have that modulating that parameter, but we just kind of manually moved it around. So see, as I'm moving it around, it's kind of changing the way it sounds. And this parameter here is kind of one of the really, really key ones in Massive, and it's called what's called the wavetable position. So a wavetable is, imagine it literally like a table, so just like a bunch of rows, and on each row you have a different sort of waveform. So, and then the difference between each kind of row isn't very big, but as you kind of move through the rows, the whole wave changes sometimes quite drastically. So as you kind of move through the wavetable, kind of through the rows of waves, then you can kind of get this kind of morphing sort of sound, which is really, really cool. That's why a lot of the time in Massive, the way you get these really interesting kind of modulations or kind of changes is by modulating this wavetable position. So we just kind of mapped this first envelope to it, clicked it and dragged it all the way around. So now whenever we trigger a note, this envelope happens and then it moves through that wavetable. Pretty cool, right? And then of course you can always dial in the actual shape of this kind of envelope with all these settings here, like the attack, the decay. So if we change the decay to a bit longer, for example. Doesn't really work, but you get the idea how depending on how this envelope looks determines how that kind of parameter or that knob moves about. It's pretty cool. But we also mapped this same envelope to a different setting, which is the intensity of the format. I won't explain exactly what intensity does, but it's just, I mean, if I kind of move this kind of knob around, you'll kind of hear the difference. That's probably the best way to describe it. So it just kind of moves it around in a it's kind of quite hard to explain why and how that works. But yeah, and that's literally the only modulations we have. So you have this simple envelope, not doing anything too fancy, modulating the wavetable position and the format. So it sounds like this. So definitely already starting to get where we want with the sound. It's got that nice attack. There's kind of that quite kind of just cool sounding attack. It's hard to really describe. And then that kind of sustained kind of low frequency thing going on. It's pretty cool. And we also have some vibrato going on. So if you have a non-cracked version of Massive and it's up to date, whenever you do like file new sound from Massive, it will program in the vibrato as default. So I didn't need to bother kind of mapping that. But if you do have a cracked version of Massive, you can always program in that vibrato as a macro setting just by going to oscillator, and then you got your vibrato settings under the oscillator tab, so you can determine the rate and the depth of the vibrato. So I have quite a bit of vibrato going on, so you can kind of hear it wobbling about. If I kind of ease back on it, see how the frequency isn't wobbling about? Whereas if we move this vibrato around, it wobbles about even more. So basically the reason why this knob is affecting these vibrato settings is because we've mapped these yellow macro knobs. So just like how we mapped that envelope to that parameter over there, we can map these macros, which are almost like main parameters, to anything we like in Massive. So the cool thing about this is this single knob, this vibrato knob, is increasing the rate very slightly, as you can see, because of that yellow little ring moving. And it's also modulating or kind of mapped to the depth as well. So we're kind of changing two parameters at once by different amounts with one knob, which is really, really cool, I think, because it means when I want to then go and change the vibrato, I don't have to kind of change two knobs at the same time or remember, oh, how do I program in vibrato, for example. It's pretty cool. And there's two final things definitely worth kind of looking at to make this kind of sound really, really good. So it sounds a little bit, it's really, really nice, but it sounds quite dry and quite kind of just kind of synthetic and not really real and interesting right now. So what two ways we can make it sound bigger and more exciting. And well, the main way is reverb. But there's another really cool reverb style thing built into Massive called Dimension Expander. It's one of the effects, and it's almost like a really short delay, but reverb, but kind of both, but not really any of them. It's kind of really hard to explain, but yeah, it's kind of like reverb and delay, and it just kind of puts things in a real space and kind of makes things sound bigger. So if I could literally turn it on, so it's just a simple effect. So you go to Effects 1, choose Dimension Expander, turn it on. So if it's off and on. See how it's just made it wider and kind of giving it depth and stuff. It's really, really cool. So it's really nice kind of effect built into Massive. And then we also did some, and the settings are just standard on that. We also put some reverb on there. So just some, again, absolutely standard reverb. Just the setting reverb, turn it on. Really, really cool. Again, it puts it in a real space because reverb is essentially reflections. So because your brain hears the original sound and all these reflections in a simulated space, it sounds like it actually came from a real space instead of just a really synthetic kind of dry sound. But as you can see, even just like standard settings and not too much kind of complexity. Normally I program in more complexity. I still make a really nice kind of rich sort of sound, really. And especially stuff like reverb works really well when you have like attacks of sounds and really plucky things, because then that kind of attack and that pluckiness kind of carries through with the kind of the decay of the reverb. But yeah, that's Massive for you, and that's how I made the sound. It's nice and simple. Probably the best thing to do is download the project file, have a look at this preset, maybe just try changing things. Maybe change the kind of the actual kind of voice or the wavetable type. So maybe we could choose DigiCook 3, see how that sounds. So you can have a bit of an experiment, maybe change some of the amounts of the mapping. So maybe we change the way this envelope 1 kind of is mapped to this format. So maybe make it more bigger, or really big. So just have a bit of a play around. I just think it's a really nice, simple way of making a cool sound, really. But yeah, been Multiply. It's been a cool little video ting for the internet, and hope you learned something. Enjoy!